Okay, we're going to go ahead and start. On behalf of RISD, Brown, and Columbia's Students for Justice in Palestine chapters, we want to thank everyone for being here with us for our final event for our Palestine Week of Action, a virtual panel on Liberatory Politics, Palestine and Everyday Resistance. We'd like to introduce our wonderful panelists, starting with Leila Abdelrazaq. Leila is a Palestinian author and artist. Her debut graphic novel, Baddawi, was shortlisted for the 2015 Palestine Book Awards and has been translated into 3 languages. She's also the creator of a number of zines and short comics. Leila's creative work primarily explores issues related to diaspora, refugeehood, history, memory, and borders. She earned her MA in Modern Middle Eastern and North African Studies from the University of Michigan in 2020, where her research focused on Palestinian futurist art and the post-national imaginaries. Leila is currently interested in exploring the intersections between abolitionist frameworks and no-state liberations. We'd also like to welcome back Sumaya Awad, who joined us a few days ago for our event on Palestine organizing and fighting intersectional corporate harm. Sumaya, thank you so much for accepting our invitation for both of these important events. Sumaya Awad is a New York-based Palestinian activist and writer. She's the co-founder of the Against Canary Mission Project, which is a platform that defends student activists who've been targeted by blacklists due to their advocacy for Palestinian human rights. She's also the director of strategy for Adalah Justice, a US-based Palestinian advocacy organization that works to shift public discourse and policy on Palestine. Sumaya is also the co-editor of Palestine, A Socialist Introduction, which we highly recommend people to read. Finally, we have Mohammed El Kurd, a nationally touring poet and writer from Jerusalem, Palestine. His work has been featured in The Guardian, This Week in Palestine, Al Jazeera English, The Nation, and the forthcoming Vacuuming Away Fire anthology, among others. His debut book, Rifqa, will be published in 2021 by Haymarket Books, and Mohammed recently graduated from the Savannah College of Art and Design with a BFA in writing, where he created Radical Blankets, an award-winning multimedia poetry magazine. He's currently pursuing an MFA in poetry from Brooklyn College. His poetry Oud album, Belly Dancing on Wounds, was released in collaboration with Palestinian musical artist Clarissa Bitar. Mohammed has spent his undergraduate weekends performing poetry at cultural centers across the US and hopes to continue this in the post-COVID-19 era. Each of our speakers will speak for about 20 minutes, and after that, we'll have around a half hour to an hour for a Q&A session. Throughout the event, you can post questions you have in the Q&A chat and direct them at a particular speaker or open it generally. We're very honored and excited that they've each accepted our invitations tonight, and without further ado, we'd like to invite Leila Abdelrazaq to begin.
Hi, thank you again so much for having me. Super honored to be here with these amazing panelists. So I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen because I'm gonna show some images from my work. Can everybody see this? Okay. Yeah. Awesome. So yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit today about my work. I'm gonna be going sort of semi-chronologically, but not exactly, through some of my older work and kind of like the political and creative impetus behind that work and how I've sort of changed in my thinking or changed in my approach over the years. So my debut graphic novel, Baddawi, was published in 2015. When I first started working on this book, it actually wasn't as a book, it was as a webcomic. And I was basically posting like short illustrated stories from my dad's life. Literally just like stories that he had told us growing up, from like mundane things to like his memories of known historical events. And at the time, I was, a freshman in college when I started working on this. I was just getting active in my own school's chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine at DePaul University in Chicago. And I was really thinking about the role of comics and storytelling in kind of helping people to understand Palestinian history and culture and just like the context of everything that Palestinians are facing and struggling with on a day-to-day basis, from sort of the mundane ways that we resist by existing to more, focused political work. And so my thinking around this was that by sharing these stories that my dad had shared with myself and my brother, that people would kind of get a window into that history and that culture. And my dad grew up in Baddawi refugee camp, which is where the name of the book comes from. It's a refugee camp, a Palestinian refugee camp in northern Lebanon. You can see on the map here from the interior of the book that Baddawi camp is up here just north of Tripoli. And so the other thing that I was thinking about as I was beginning to work on this webcomic was that you know, even within Palestinian communities, or at least like the organizing communities that I was a part of in Chicago at the time, there was a lot of focus on Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza, which is very important, but there was not as much conversation around Palestinians from the camps. And the camps have a really rich history of being, you know, centers of resistance and Palestinian cultural life and production, and continues to this day. But I felt like this whole aspect and dimension of Palestinian life was just being left out of the conversation. And so part of what I wanted to do too was kind of bring those stories and those narratives into focus as well. And so, yeah, I was using stories both, you know, sort of weird, funny stories that my dad had told us about, like, I don't know, he had this thing when he was a kid where the kids would play marbles in the camp, and he ended up like cheating a bunch of kids out of their marbles and then selling the marbles back to them, and then his mom got really mad. So like there's stories like that in the book. There's also stories about you know, sort of more known historical events, especially during the Lebanese Civil War at the time, and like his memories of those days. And those political events sort of from a personal perspective. And I used a lot of tatreez and traditional Palestinian embroidery, as you can see on the cover here, and also in here. I was kind of, as an artist, trying to explore like, what does a Palestinian aesthetic mean to me? Like, how can I include these like historical and cultural motifs visually within the work I'm producing? And working in like a black and white style at the same time, as somebody who was super and continues to be super inspired by sort of the DIY indie comics scene in the US, and sort of these like, you know, zine cultures, DIY cultures, and interestingly, like the reason that a lot of this work is done in black and white is because it's the cheapest to photocopy, right? So like, you work in black and white, and you go and photocopy your zine, and like you're doing it as cheap as possible. And if you worked in color, when you go to photocopy it, you're gonna lose something if it has to be in black and white. So you start in black and white and you never lose anything when you photocopy. And so those are sort of my like creative and visual inspirations. And so I was sort of working within that tradition, but also trying to find my voice as a Palestinian artist. I also started the book off from the Nakba, and sort of gave that prologue because I didn't want people to kind of read it and be like, oh, you know, he's in this refugee camp, we don't know why. Like, no, the Nakba as like the starting point was very important for me. And so I think throughout this whole book process, which I basically worked on through 2011 until 2015 when it was finished, was very much both political, like the political thinking that I talked about before, but also very personal. I was born in Chicago. My mom is white and my dad is Palestinian. And I never met most of my family members until I was 15. I never went to Lebanon. And that's where like all of my cousins and aunts and uncles, almost all of them, except for a few of them, live in Baddawi camp. And so I think like looking back, a big part of this project for me was just like trying to understand where I came from, trying to understand that history and like learn it through telling these stories and like talking to my dad, traveling to Lebanon and like spending time with my family, overcoming like the language barriers that I had, which is still a struggle. All of these things were like wrapped into this project and continue to like flow into my other work as well, although in different ways. And there's some like early kind of interviews with me where I talk about this book, and I talk about how it's for like a Western audience, and that's very much true. Like when I was working on this book, I was thinking a lot about mainstream white American audiences and what they need to know about Palestinians. And, you know, it's been like an effective tool for that, I think, for me, like when I was traveling around and talking about the book and using it as like a mechanism to talk about these things, going to like, I don't know, the Center for Comic Studies in California and talking to like a room full of people who are interested in comics actually about Palestine, like, and how empowering that was, and how I was able to use it as a vehicle. But at some point in my creative work, I started to feel that that was a little bit limiting to just be like constantly using your work to defend your own humanity and the humanity of your people. And so I started to become a little bit more interested in talking to other Palestinians, especially the first time, or I think it was the second time I went to Palestine for the Palestine Festival of Literature in 2015, shortly after my book was published. And I started to create these images that were both exploring and explaining my experience in Palestine, but also sort of talking to other Arabs and other Palestinians. This image in particular from like an illustration series that I did after PalFest, and actually there's another one that's not included here, but I was really grappling on that trip with the issue of occupation tourism and what it means to go and see the oppression of the Palestinian people, especially because I was one of the only Palestinians on the trip. I felt that my experience on that trip was very different from many of the other like non-Palestinian people, and so this image was sort of reflective of that, and I'm using the Handala character here, which was a character that represents the Palestinian refugee child created by Naji Al-Ali, the Palestinian political cartoonist, which actually there's also a reference to him on the cover of this book. That's like a direct reference and sort of like a signal. So at that time I was signaling, I was using these like imagery to kind of signal to other Palestinians and send, like maybe a Palestinian would look at this cover and, you know, notice a link between this image and Handala. And there's other things like that throughout the book where I use symbolism and imagery that speaks to other Palestinians or other Arabs that other people might gloss over. But I think as I continued to progress in my work, I started really thinking more about what I want to say to other Palestinians, what I want to say to other Arabs, what kinds of conversations I want to have that I don't necessarily want other people to be privy to. And so I started to really explore, I think this was one of the last times I did like an explainy sort of like, you know, here is how oppression works comic for the Believer magazine in 2018 about my experiences at borders around the world and different things that I had encountered. And they had asked me later to do another comic on the topic again, and I just wasn't able to do it. I was like, you know, I already did this comic for you. Like, I was trying to work on it and I just couldn't figure out what more I had to say. And I think that's because at that time I was really moving into kind of exploring intra-Palestinian issues. And so the first sort of major work in which I started to do that was through the opening in 2017, which was a short comic. I got a grant from the small comics publisher Fish, which is based out of Beirut, and they provided a grant for the production of this comic, which they then published. And so this comic was basically exploring the relationship between, I guess it was basically exploring the idea of absence and trying to figure out what kind of weight absence can have on your life when you feel it. And so the way I was starting to explore that was through this story about my sister who was a stillborn when I was like 2 or 3 years old. And I don't even have like a memory of this happening. And so a lot of it is based on my mom and dad's stories and what they've told me about that time, and it's also very imaginative because I don't actually have memories of this piece of my life. And so I was sort of exploring, like, what does it mean to miss a person you never knew, like to feel the absence of the sister you never had, and what does it mean to miss a place you've never been to? And I decided very intentionally with this comic that I wasn't going to explain a lot or at all about Palestine. I was just going to let these two stories come together and explore them visually, explore them through text, explore the relationship between these two narratives without trying to offer too much explanation for people. And that was my first sort of move away from really like breaking down things for people or explaining things to people and just letting my work be. And when I look at like my body of work now, I think about the opening and I think about, oh, this is another excerpt, but I think about the opening and I think about another zine that I self-published as sort of, I guess like things that I feel are the most reflective of what I would, the kind of work I would like to be making as an artist and the kind of work, because in those moments when I was telling those stories, I think I felt the most free because I wasn't thinking about what do I need to explain to other people or how do I need to make sure that like a white American audience understands what I'm talking about here? How am I going to make sure that they're, you know, getting the right like political message? It's very much like these pieces are more about my relationship to my Palestinianness and like exploring that. And so this is, through this comic, I was also sort of exploring faith as somebody who, again, like is biracial and grew up sort of without religion and navigating my relationship to Islam and what that means to me as someone who's not really known how to like enter those traditions always. And so there's a piece of that as well in here, and sort of trying to figure out how to, again, like, you know, exist within all of these things that I was sort of estranged from as somebody like growing up in diaspora and then trying to like learn about and understand later and sort of grappling with that more directly. So here you can see I am attempting to pronounce the ha and my dad is correcting me and there's no offer of translation or explanation for what this panel means, and that's intentional. And so this is like the last page of that comic. To her we belong and to her we shall return. And so again, it's like playing on ideas of return and diaspora and faith and all of these things that are messy and complicated and don't have good answers. And again, like not offering translation and doing that intentionally. Even with my like limited Arabic. And then the fig tree is another one where in this one actually I'm talking about masturbation, but it's an exploration of like Palestinian womanhood and like how I relate to that as somebody who has a white mother. And so like my mom taught me a lot of amazing things, but one thing that she could not teach me or does not fully understand is like what it means to be a Palestinian woman. And so like those are things that I've sort of had to like learn from like female relatives on my dad's side. Sometimes there's like a lot of language barriers, sometimes, you know, from other mentors and friends in my life. And so I think this piece, The Fig Tree, was sort of the start of trying to unpack what it means for me and cobble together how I relate to that very particular intersection of race and gender, or ethnicity and gender, you know, and navigating that. And so there's, again, a lot of imagery and kind of exploring tradition and obligation as well, and how that plays into all of these questions. And so the last sort of more recent comic I'll share is The Sardine Tin, which is was published in 2019, where I'm kind of thinking about, again, issues of like history and memory and what these things really mean. And I think I had a series of like personal experiences within organizing that were very difficult for me, that caused me to sort of question a lot of the I don't know, approaches or ways that we have historically like dealt with the messy reality of our history and the messy reality of like life as a colonized person, and the sort of avoidance of messy conversations that frustrated me, or things that are not like straightforward. And so in this comic, I was sort of exploring these issues through the exploration of the sardine. The sardine being something that is ubiquitous throughout like Palestinian refugee camps, is like a food that is often distributed by UNRWA, but is not, you know, embraced as a symbol of Palestinian cuisine or anything like that. And so I was kind of trying to utilize the symbol of the sardine as something that's sort of overlooked or undervalued, and at the same time use that image to explore aspects of Palestinian history that are, again, like under interrogated or sort of brushed to the side or covered up. And so that's sort of the direction that my newer work is moving into. And I think I might have gone a little over time, but I'm gonna stop there and let the other amazing panelists take over from here, if I can figure out how to stop sharing. Yeah, stop sharing this thing.
Sumaya said everything I needed to say. But no, thank you so much to both of you for your amazing input. I guess I truly really wanted to say a lot of what both of you have said, so I'm just gonna take it into a literature perspective. I'm gonna be reading poetry today also, so I'll leave it in, but I'm gonna be reading poems from my book, Rifqa. The book was named after my grandmother, and the reason I mentioned the book, it's not even out yet. It's gonna be published with Haymarket later in the year. But the reason I mention it isn't to plug it, but a few years ago, I was following a friend's advice. I was maybe 14 or 15, and I was writing poems in Jerusalem. And this friend was like, lay down all of your poems, so that way you can structure it into a book. And I did so. And I found my grandmother in every book, in every poem. And that's how the book came about, to write about her. Now, this year, or the year before, actually, when Haymarket wanted to publish me, I did the same thing again, and I laid out all of my poems on the ground. And I found 2 issues in my poems. And I believe these 2 issues are prevalent, not only in my poetry, but in Palestinian literature at large. I know I'm only like 22 years old and on here like criticizing Palestinian literature at large, but I feel like it must be said. So I want to talk to you today about a little bit about my mistakes in writing poetry, about Palestine, and how I kind of trained myself to step out of that. But first, I'm gonna share a tiny poem called "God is a Refugee." It's not by me. It's actually by a Palestinian poet called Rashid Hussein. This poem is from 1994. In 1994, Israel, what is now known as Israel, created this law called absentee property law, which mandated that Israel has the authority to seize and steal whichever Palestinian lands, houses, after the Palestinians were externally or internally displaced in Palestine in the construction of what we know now as Israel, right? Rashid Hussein wrote this poem because the jargon of that law is impenetrable, right? And we understand that when Zionism or when settler colonialism or when oppressive forces like the United States also constructs law or codifies injustice into a law, a lot of the time these laws are, legislated in language that doesn't seem so harmful. So what Rashid Hussein did with this poem was satirize that law. And by satirizing it, he kind of explained it to the Palestinian farmers or the Palestinian civilians who didn't necessarily have the legal jargon down on lock, so I'll just read it. الله أصبح لاجئا يا سيدي صادر إذا حتى بساط المسجد وبع الكنيسة فهي من أملاكه وبع المؤذن في المسجد الأسود حتى يتامانا أبوهم غائب ساطر يتامانا إذا يا سيدي. God is now a refugee, sir, so confiscate even the rugs of the mosque. Sell the church, it is his property. Sell the imam in the black auction. Even our orphans, their father is absent. Confiscate our orphans. So yeah, so what I think Rashid Hussain did in this poem is really taking Israeli language and putting it apart. And this is something, you know, I came to the United States in 2016. I was born and raised in Jerusalem. And from the start, I realized a chasm in between how I witnessed my reality as a Palestinian from Jerusalem and how people here who are pro-Palestine or not pro-Palestine saw my reality. And this chasm made me realize that over the years, our demands as Palestinians have been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And the very fact that we're asking like Israel to vaccinate us, to comply with international law, the fact that we need even Israel to vaccinate us is indicative of that, is indicative of our demands constantly shrinking. We went from wanting settler colonialism to leave our land to wanting to like have a tiny state in whatever islands we have now that are surrounded by settlements. So understanding those things made me kind of point out two mistakes that I made in my writing. The first mistake was I trained myself to be unbiased. So what I'd refer, unbiased in between quotes, obviously, but what I'd refer to in Arabic as an entity, in English, it would become a state. Like stealing would become confiscate, and dispossess would become evict. And this one hits close to home because actually I live in Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood in Jerusalem that the Israelis have been trying to seize since 1948, and our house was taken. Actually, half of our house was taken in 2009. 5 of our neighbors' home were taken in 2009, and actually in May, we might lose the second part of our home, and 12 other families might lose their homes. But the way it's reported about in the media, it's reported as, you know, eviction. And eviction implies this legal authority to seize and take over somebody's home because you kind of own it. But the gag is they don't own it, it's our house. So they're stealing it. So realizing those words that I use that are really like within that status quo that I'll talk about in a little bit, helped me really like vocabularize and understand how I can participate to Palestinian resistance literature without watering it down. I think this obsession that Palestinians have with like sounding objective or sounding unbiased or, you know, just sounding neutral is because we kind of worship this myth of objectivity instead of satirizing it. We're not really honest with ourselves that this policy, these words are just like words that some men decided to like name, and now we like follow in them, like this idea of a green line or idea of this or that, or like all of these ideas that we're hostage to as Palestinians that force us to lessen our demands year after year. They're not buildings, they're like words by a bunch of dudes that wrote words. And it is our duty to combat these words by saying whatever we want to say. For example, and this is just a small example. As I said, my house is getting taken. And I was on this call with a bunch of prime members of parliament in the UK about it. And they were like, oh, we're so sorry this is happening. We believe in Palestinian human rights, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, okay, what are you gonna do? And they were like, well, we're just gonna condemn it, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, okay, this is not enough. We need sanctions. And they were like, well, sanctions are unrealistic. And I was like, no, they're not unrealistic. You can threaten with sanctions. You can, like, who said they're unrealistic? And then a week later, they sent a letter to the Israeli foreign minister in the UK, and they actually threatened with sanctions in the letter. So I'm saying like, and obviously like I doubt anything's gonna come out of it. But what I'm saying is, as a Palestinian, when you're on a panel, when you're organizing, when you're whatever, demand everything. Demand all of it, like whatever whatever you like, pretend you're talking to God. And when you're talking to God, you don't hold back. So demand everything, demand end for settler colonialism, demand that all of our prisoners should be freed. All of them, not just like the political prisoners, not just the prisoners under administrative detention, all of the prisoners. Demand everything. The second mistake I found is humanization, which both of you kind of talked about already, and so I'll be brief about it. But we have this tendency to show ourselves as human because we have been so fucking dehumanized in the past and still continue to do so. So even when I'm talking about Sheikh Jarrah, my neighborhood, I have to constantly say that my father is like in his 70s, that my grandmother had been, was over 100 years old, that, we have children sleeping on the street. And this is a less dramatic version of what other people have to, like the trauma that other people have to broadcast and convey in order to get people to support you. But at the end of the day, what's going on isn't that we are being victimized. What's going on is that there's a sustainable machine that will continue to victimize us unless it's addressed. And this is when the question of like humanitarian aid and the idea of human rights comes in, because sure, UNRWA should give us money, sure. And I believe after liberation, whatever Israel is, should pay us for like 70 years. But those things should come first as tackling an issue, tackling the occupation first and foremost, tackling settler colonialism first and foremost. I've been talking and touring whatever since 2016, and I've been so sick and tired of getting on stage, and the first thing somebody wants to ask me is about Hamas or about suicide bombings. And I had this route of like, kind of condemning Hamas or blah, blah, blah. But I'm realizing like, no, if somebody's going to mention Hamas, like, what about it? What about Hamas? Hamas has a right to exist under international law. Doesn't mean I agree or disagree with them. But what about Hamas? What about suicide bombers? Why are we being asked about violence from the most violent people on earth? This country, the United States, that was built on genocide and slavery, is continuing to terrorize the entirety of the world. How are we answering them about violence? How are we like reporting to them about violence? That's funny. That doesn't add up. How are we like worrying about how we're going to present ourselves as submissive or passive or non-violent to Israel that is killing people and children and women and children? And even like why are we even continually like saying these things, right? So those are the two mistakes I kind of made in my writing that I believe are valuable, and people should think about the way we encounter Palestine. And when we talk about Palestine, we need to be peacocks when we talk about Palestine. We need to be so arrogant and obnoxious about it. We need to be like, yeah, we want this and that and everything. We want this and that and a bag of chips. We're not just going to settle for whatever they give us. And I think this is where my political convictions crystallized, was when I did those things, was when I was able to talk about those things in a defiant way, in a way that kind of kicks its feet up on the table. So that's what I ask of everybody watching, is to kick your feet up on the table and be arrogant and demand whatever the fuck you want, because they're not giving us anything. They are literally not giving us anything. And I'm so tired of these politics of appeal that we have trained ourselves, we have muzzled ourselves. The very fact that BDS is called anti-Semitic, something as benign as BDS, the very fact that the International Crime Court is getting called anti-Semitic for investigating war crimes should tell you that we need to be more defiant and more loud in those accusations, because we are being stifled by these accusations. And we also shouldn't be paying those accusations too much of our time or our effort. Like, anti-Semitism is horrible and bad. What I'm doing is not anti-Semitic. End of story. Like, it should be as simple as that. Especially, this is something that I've been battling with for a few years, because there are literal Israelis in my house right now. In half of my house, there are literal Israelis who actually came from Brooklyn and did birthright and are in my house. And they belong to organizations like Nikhlat Sham'on, Il'ad, and Atarit Kohanim, who are working here actually to working in the United States to actually dispossess Black and brown communities here in New York. So at a certain point, I'm just like, it doesn't make sense anymore, because there are literally Israelis in my house. I have a right to talk about them whatever way I want. You cannot call me anti-Semitic for it. So I'll just end here, and I'm gonna read a few poems. I think I'm doing good on time. Let me know if take too much time. The first poem I'm gonna read is called The Biggest Punchline of All Time. And I'm just gonna read it because the book is about my grandmother, and this poem is about my grandmother. Okay. Rifqa took from me my Molotovs. If not a metaphor, they'd make a good vase for jasmines, a good jazz for the dinner table where revolution is TV volume lowered to make room for conversation. Over the years, her fingers thinned, veins like vines, verandas required less wandering, and Teta gave up the remote control. I fear this poem will turn eulogy in real time. Sheikh on the screen babbles about relief. It is what comes after patience. After patience, there is but a grave, Teta says. Why cradle a century-old whose punchlines are still intact? Her daughter-in-law, my mother, is her cane. When not a metaphor, her cane is the edge of a bed or the edge of a sentence. She clings on to physics and wit. Her cane, never a stick for the elderly. She who once knew purple shrouds, who once knew clouds as lint, and her hair shall not bow her head. It's a fight, really. 4 a.m. and my parents are screaming hospitals. Teta fell again. She's okay. Alhamdulillah. 100 years tightroping the distance between pride and self-respect. I grew up in a circus. I grew up in ERs, and death post the ER was uncommon. Teta walks fragile. She's a straight spine in theory. I got from her hunch and her hunch. Last July, she asked how we're getting home. On our bikes, I said, giggling. You take your bike and I'll take my horse. Her punchlines intact, her smirk unwavering. Assign imagination to memory, Molotovs in Fendi bags, pamphlets and python shoes, silk scarves masquerading ramage. A grandson fascinated by both rebellions. Teta remembers what she has to. Rifles and rice bags, Billy split open, women mistaking pillows for offspring, men sirening the street performing ardor, women whose gods no longer respond, men emasculated by refugee status. She does not remember my name. Unkindness is much more memorable than blood. She remembers 7 decades later what martyred her homeland the first time. Political conviction sticks, chance chandeliering her subconscious. Habibi, why are you in America? Shu, school, God bless you. Muhammad who? Why America? Be careful. Tell them America is the reason. Tell them drink the sea. Let them ride their tallest horses. Jerusalem is ours. The biggest punchline of all time. I'm imagining people are clapping. I hate reading poetry on Zoom. Okay, I'm gonna read. I'm kidding. You don't have to. I'm kidding. Okay, I'm gonna read another one. This next one is called Bush. About Bush. Bush, shoe to the head. I've never felt pride like this. Bush, shoe to the head. Mother was in the kitchen. Saddam in a noose. Handsome. Apologies wrapped in tweed. USA reigns in Eid. I wish a snake would swallow me. I wish the earth would split and swallow me. Bush towers astray. I don't believe in conversation or reconciliation or crowds gouging out my eyes. Millionaires giving out charity as if it's charity when cents don't make a dent. We're supposed to say thanks. They acknowledge our blood on their hands. I wish a snake would swallow me. I wish the earth would split and swallow me. Bush sits beside me on the train. Iraq veteran cites his fear of fireworks. They think they're the only ones with PTSD. We're literate in peeling off our own skin to sleep, live like walking debris, swallow snakes, swallow whole pharmacies, wrap our spines around the fingers of bank tellers, while Bush is at a Joann's, picking the perfect blue. Thank you. This next, let's see how I'm doing on time. Okay. This next poem is called 15-Year-Old Girl Killed While Attempting to Kill a Soldier, or context. And I'll give a brief introduction to this poem. So if you're speaking about Palestine at a US campus or at an event or whatever, and something happens in Palestine, you are expected to be the speaker of all Palestinians. So whenever I had a poetry reading going on or something not even related to Palestine, and something happened, somebody would be like, oh, do you condemn this girl who killed a soldier or like tried to kill a soldier? And my 18-year-old self at the time would be like, yes, of course, violence is bad. It's not bad. And I wrote this poem about that. So this poem's called Context. Context, fruit knife to a firearm. He was in her throat. 15-year-old girl denounced, violence is not children taking on dragons. For me, it has always been apologies, running to catastrophe with context, commissioning compassion, turning heroes into human. This is a refuted revolution. TV said her brother was a martyr, but martyrs go with intent. He went bullet to the head, from fist to flounder. Context is hand in his pocket, toy guns. I told the people that day disclaimer, dead girl shouldn't have found her wage in the kitchen drawer. She was reaching for crayons. Solidarity often is a refuted revolution. I hold my arsenal. People who give excuses for execution, I held my arsenal. People who give excuses for executions fear the rifle more than they fear the reason. I put her in tool, girl to their gaze, angel to their accusation. Otherwise, fruit knife becomes the villain, despite context. Context is they want cats declawed, they want knock doors unanswered, they want the other cheek. Terrorist avenges. Headlines delusional. Are all heads equal? Is a soldier's heart equal to her brother's? I'll hold my arsenal. When they ask me next time, I'll say God held her hand. Thank you. Let's see. This next poem is called Girls in the Refugee Camp. And I just want to read this poem because I want to shout out one of my favorite organizations in Palestine called Al-Qaws for Gender and Sexual Diversity. So I wrote this poem about sexual and gender, what would it feel to be of sexual and gender diversity in a refugee camp or in Jerusalem or wherever in occupied Palestine. Soldier, hands you hash and a handcuff. Van, coffins your spine. Road takes you where it takes you. Many prisons in the journey, seldom doves in the destination. You are Damascus and you are the gate. Born on the brink of a breath, on the brink of a death, born on the brink of a breath, on the brink of a death, pain teats in your mother, your throat, a minaret, hospital bed, a prayer rug, Allahu Akbar. Your family announces your boyhood and your doom. Birth begins to have you. You're a cliche in the wind. Lipstick on a mirror, shrouds and leopard print, bricks thrown wrong, your tongue genders as it needs in barbershops and bureaucracy, thick voice from a vending machine softens at the ring of a phone. Your father was a bullet away before a bullet took him. Came home a martyr, never a father, you were destined the man. You are an orphan and you are the womb. Body, a storm in waiting rooms, frowning, spitting, sitting in a whirlpool, waiting on rhythm to resurge, on surgeries to affirm, on gavels to blow in favor of your truth. Sky here is made of tin. Children drive taxis and drive their bread. Prostitutes gum on traffic stops. Faces smug, windows rolled up. Your ambition is ammunition bulletless. You are the poor and you are out of the gate. Your hands don't open. Your hunger does not announce. You move what you move to move up. You doubt who you doubt. Soldier hands you hash and a handcuff. Hijacks your half. You are the prisoner and you are the cell. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, do we have time? I have 2 more poems. Do we have time?
Yeah, we're on time. You can go ahead and read them for sure.
Perfect. Sorry. Yeah, thank you so much. This next poem is called Antibiography. I've actually never read this out loud at an event, but it's about what we were talking about in terms of just having to flatten yourself and become, consumable by a white American audience. And yeah, I'm just trying to locate it. This is why I'm stalling. Okay, cool. Antibiography. I am but my credentials, apparently, in third person in pretense. I am but Jerusalem too, published by way of their remorse. Snipers to my spine, bombs, women, children, etc. Apologies for the inverted syntax. I am reluctant to say what I write about. I don't know anymore. The question is about the earth. Primates over prose. Most days I'm in psychosis, spine to my storms, bait to my rage, tired metaphors. I think identity is corny. That would have enraged me at 17. My currents believe would have. except for the rifles. We all agree on the rifles. I am but the institution, the prestige, the watermelon. Most of that poetry is theater over thunder. Most days I'm pulling pythons off my ribs. I don't hope for much more than what my grandmother hoped for. Most of the rest is maskhara. How do you translate maskhara? I am but all that performance, who took poets off park benches to put commercials for poets on park benches, who took poets off my shelves to put pills where poets once were. I'm on a recliner, paying $200 an hour to make villains out of coffee stains. I gulp metaphors without counting. I am but my love for my land, by the way. إني اخترتك يا وطني حبا وطواعية. In truth, I'm ashamed of my dreams. There are those who dream of seeing the ocean, Palestinian men who saw the grave before they saw the gravel, the coffin before the coast. Outlet blank commissions. The psychological effects of occupation. I have never once felt free anywhere, not with the Jordanian passport even, not in Santa Monica, the American Tel Aviv, not in New York, the American Tel Aviv, not in Tel Aviv, the American Tel Aviv. I am but my nostalgia, my sick homesickness, bike through Brooklyn, Jewish neighborhoods, Radio Israel. This is a yearning for rage. I'm in Stockholm. What else goes into a bio? On Judgment Day, God asks your parents about you. I am but my obedience to my mother. Ridaki ya ummi. God said it apparently. I keep my secrets to keep her sane, not breaking cycles if that'll break her heart. She's had a tough life. Those are her years to rest. Thank you. And the last poem I'm gonna do is called This Is Why We Dance. This is just like the poem I always do because people know it. I don't really love this poem, but I'm just gonna do it. But to give context, this poem I wrote after our house was dispossessed in 2009, and my aunt, alongside her neighbors who are women, decided to take pots and pans and take onto the streets and protest, and then thousands of people followed, and that became a tradition in varying, numbers. Since then, every Friday we protest in Sheikh Jarrah. So this is about that. This is why we dance. Home in my memory is a green, worn-out couch, and my grandmother in every poem. Every jasmine picked up the backlash, every backlash picked up the tear gas, and tear gas healed with yogurt and onions, with resilience, with women chanting and drumming on pots and pans, with goddams and Hasbi Allah. They work tanks, but we know stones. 2008, the Gaza bombings. My ritual of watching TV ran between the grieving and Egyptian belly dance music, and I fluctuated between hatred and adoration, stacking and hoarding Darwish's reasons to live, sometimes believing them, sometimes dipping my bread in indulgence, knowing a child is breadless in Khan Yunis, dipped in a roof's rubble. If you ask me where I'm from, it's not a one-word answer. Be prepared, seated, sober, geared. If hearing about a world other than yours makes you uncomfortable, drink the sea, cut off your ears, blow another bubble to bubble your bubble, and the pretense blow another town of bodies in the name of fear. This is why we dance. My father told me anger is a luxury we cannot afford. Be composed, calm, still. Laugh when they ask you, smile when they talk, answer them, educate them. This is why we dance, because if I speak, I'm dangerous. You open your mouth, you raise your eyebrows, you point your fingers. This is why we dance, because even my poetry is not free. This is why we dance. Wounded feet, but the rhythm remains, no matter the adjectives on my shoulder, because even my poetry isn't free. Now please tell me, why is anger, even anger, a luxury to me? Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be on this panel with such amazing panelists, and I am humbled that you took the time to let me read to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. All of those were so moving, and I'm sure everyone was mentally clapping for you, even though we can't actually.